everyone, and welcome to this history video focusing on African American civil rights during the years 1945 to 1965. So looking at the civil rights groups that were active at this time, there were four main ones. Firstly, the NAACP. This was established in 1909 and their method was legal action, so it was a group of lawyers. And one of the greatest achievements was the Brown Judgment 1954. This case said that school segregation was unconstitutional, and so it reversed the Plessy versus Ferguson judgment from 1896, which had said that segregation was allowed as long as the facilities were separate but equal. Although this case de jure ended segregation in schools, de facto segregation continued in the South way up until the 70s, because black and white still lived in separate communities, so there was still segregation as they'd go to the school closest to them. Secondly is SCLC, established in 1956. This was Martin Luther King's party, and it was about Southern Christian leadership. The big thing that they achieved was the March on Washington 1963, but it dispersed after 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated. Thirdly was CORE, established in 1942, and this was a bit of a more radical group. In 1968, they expelled whites, so they no longer allowed whites to be a member of the group, but they remained non-violent, although their activities were often illegal, and it would later become a Black Power group. Finally is SNCC, established in 1960, and it stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1966, they expelled whites and they dropped the non-violence part of their group, and they later formed Black Power, so it was also a more radical group. So now looking at some of the main successes during this time. Firstly was the Montgomery bus boycott 1955 to 56, and this was a huge success because 85% of African Americans in the area participated, and the Supreme Court forced the city council to desegregate buses. Next was Little Rock in 1957. This was when the NAACP organised for 9 black students to enter a white school, and in response, President Eisenhower federalised the National Guard, which meant that he had control of the National Guard to enforce the integration of that school. Another key moment was Birmingham 1963, where students from local schools were marching, and so many of them were arrested that they filled up the jails so that no more of them could be arrested, like it was an intentional method. And the local police were ordered to compromise after they released police dogs and fire hoses on the people, so they were very violent against the non-violent protesters. Then the big moment was the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King did his famous Dream speech. This involved all 4 key civil rights groups cooperating to get 250,000 people into Washington, and they managed to remain non-violent the whole time. In response, JFK promised to have a civil rights bill, and 25% of the people attending were white, so this shows the shift towards white public opinion supporting black civil rights. So the common sequence with all of these protests was that the protests would remain non-violent and peaceful, but they'd been met with the violent local police and racist backlash. This would lead to widespread media coverage both in the USA and worldwide, which would embarrass America, which would force the federal government to intervene and improve civil rights. So LBJ, who assumed presidency after JFK was assassinated, passed 2 key legislations that were really important to African American civil rights. Firstly was the Civil Rights Act 1964, and this was passed in response to Birmingham and March on Washington in 1963. This act banned legal discrimination and segregation on the basis of race and gender, and it also reduced the state's power by allowing the Attorney General to intervene and enforce this act using federal officials. So this made discrimination a federal issue rather than an individual state issue. The second piece of legislation was the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This was passed in response to the actions at Selma, which was the largest non-violent march in the South ever. This act ensured that African Americans could vote, and it had a de facto effect, as the percentage of those who could vote in Mississippi went from 6% to 60% in just 3 years. So now looking at the presidents during this time period, there was President Truman, who was a Democrat. He desegregated the armed forces, he tried to pass a civil rights bill, and he even appointed a black federal judge. Next was President Eisenhower, who was a Republican. He was the one who federally enforced the integration of Little Rock High School, And he did pass a couple civil rights acts, but they were ineffective as Congress heavily diluted them and made them just really ineffective. Then there's President Kennedy, who was a Democrat, and he desegregated public transport, and he had his New Frontier program, which aimed to reduce poverty. However, most of the time he only really intervened under pressure, like he promised to do a Civil Rights Act in response to all the protests, but he didn't willingly want to do it. Then there's President Johnson, also a Democrat, and he passed the Civil Rights Act 1964, Voting Rights Act 1965. He banned poll taxes using the new amendment, which meant that you wouldn't have to pay to vote anymore. He federalized the National Guard, and he also had his version of the New Frontier called the Great Society, which aimed to reduce black poverty. A common issue with the presidents at this time is that they were preoccupied with the Cold War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Also, they were largely reactive, so they only passed civil rights legislation if they felt pressured to.